Welcome to the live stream. Um, Welcome to the live stream. I'm just gonna put it somewhere. Okay, think that's good. I'll leave it there so that way people can see the name. So this is a Canadian serial killer and rapist, a Canadian serial killer and rapist, Colonel Russell Williams. And Russell Williams is linked to missing Americans. Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America, he's right about making Canada the 51st state. And now there's always been a good reason. There's been many reasons actually. But especially now, since Americans are finally starting to realize how corrupt Canada is, that the Americans should do an investigation into this guy, Colonel Russell Williams, who was convicted of raping and murdering Canadian women for years, and the Canadian police covered it up. And the victims sued the Canadian police. The victims of Colonel Russell Williams sued the Ontario Provincial Police for the cover up. They sued them. And some of the victims even won in court against the Canadian military psychopath commander. But there was a big cover up, and it took years for the women to finally get justice. And then there was still even a big cover up because what Americans don't know is this Canadian serial killer, rapist, he's linked to missing Americans, especially missing American women who went missing near the Canadian border. And so missing American women went missing near the Canadian border, and there's circumstantial evidence which the Canadian government covered up because the Canadian government did not want like a big war, a big issue to break out between Canada and the United States. And also the American families of the missing Americans would go crazy when they found out that Canada and this Canadian military commander is probably responsible and linked to the missing American women, missing Americans, etc. This guy, this military commander of Canada, was getting away with rape and murder for years, and the Canadian police covered it up. And he's also linked to the missing Americans. And Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America, needs to do a full investigation into trying to find these missing Americans, which are linked to this Canadian psychopath, this Canadian former ex-military commander of all of Canada, this Canadian psychopath serial killer, Colonel Russell Williams. So Donald Trump is right about making Canada the 51st state because Canada is so corrupt, and the Americans need to do a full investigation into Canada, and the Americans need to send a full investigation team to go through all of the Canadian government files, because if an American investigation team goes through all of the Canadian government files, they will see cover-ups, they will see the gun control agenda to disarm Americans. Canada has been the one pushing the gun control agenda for years to try to disarm as many Americans as possible and take guns away from as many Americans as possible. Canada was pushing a lot of these gun control campaigns. Canada pushes communist propaganda among American states. Canada is behind a lot of the corruption in the United States. And one could even ask, was Canada behind the California wildfires? So Donald Trump, President of the United States, has good reason to send an American investigation team to Canada to go through all of the Canadian government files and also to investigate the missing the link between Colonel Russell Williams and the missing Americans, because there was never a proper investigation done, because the Canadian government didn't even want to admit that this Canadian military psychopath was murdering Canadian women and raping Canadian women. And that's why the Canadian women, the victims of Colonel Russell Williams, they sued the Ontario Provincial Police. They sued the Canadian police because the Canadian police were engaging in a cover-up. And Canada, the Canadian government, and the Canadian military didn't even want to admit that this Canadian psychopath is from the military, who was the military commander of all of Canada, that he was doing it to Canadian women. They didn't even want to admit that he was doing it to Canadian women. So you better believe there was a big cover-up with the connection, the link between this Canadian military psychopath and the missing Americans. And if Trump and America wants to try to find the missing Americans, they should send an American investigation team to Canada to go through all of the Canadian government files. And when the Americans really see how corrupt Canada is and all of the evil stuff that Canada has done and all of the cover-ups and all of the gun control campaigns that Canada has supported and pushed to try to disarm the American people, when the United States of America sends an investigation team to Canada to go through all of the Canadian government files, then there will be really good reason to make Canada the 51st state. And when Canadians finally see the evidence, how corrupt the Canadian government is, there will probably be a vote. There will probably be a referendum. There was a referendum with Quebec. So about 20 something years ago, whatever, 20, 30 years ago, around that time, Quebec, the entire province of Quebec, wanted to separate from Canada. There was a referendum, there was a vote, whether or not Quebec would separate from Canada. It didn't happen. It was close. It was I think 50-50, I think. It was very close, but it didn't happen. But after America exposes all of the corruption in Canada, after America finds the missing American women, and after America exposes Canada for the corruption that is Canada, then I'm sure if we'd had another vote, if we had another referendum where Canadians could decide whether they want to become the 51st state, I bet you once Donald Trump shows Canadians the truth and all the corruption in Canada, I bet you that most Canadians would vote to become, in the next referendum, they would vote to become the 51st state of the United States of America. So we need Donald Trump, the President of the United States, the President of the most powerful country in the world, the United States, the Chief and Commander of the American military. We need President Donald Trump to do a full investigation into Canada, send an American investigation team to go through all of the Canadian government files, to go through all of the Canadians, even CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, they have done operations against the United States of America. CSIS has done covert operations. CSIS is Canada's version of the CIA. So America has the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. America has the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. Canada has CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, has done covert operations to try to meddle in American elections, undermine the United States economy, hack American computers and American computer infrastructure, promote gun control campaigns to try to disarm as many Americans as possible. CSIS has been behind the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, has been behind a lot of the corruption that has happened in the United States of America. And maybe Canada had a big involvement behind 9/11. Maybe Canada played a big part behind 9/11. But unless the United States sends an investigation team to Canada to go through all of the Canadian government files, the United States will never know the truth. The United States will never discover the truth unless the United States sends an investigation team, an American investigation team to Canada to go through all of the Canadian government files. And then you'll find out once you go through the files, once you go through the Canadian government files, then you'll see if Canada had a part to play behind 9/11. Then you'll see if Canada had something to do with the Boston Marathon. Then you'll see if Canada had something to do with COVID, the COVID pandemic. Then you'll see if Canada had something to do with California being on fire. Then you'll see if Canada had something to do with the Flint, Michigan water crisis. Then you'll see if Canada had something to do with mad cow disease. Wow, a lot of stuff's happened to Americans. Then you'll see if Canada had something to do with the rigged election when Trump lost to Biden. Then you'll see all of these things, all of these, the January 6th riot on Capitol Hill. Then you will see if Canada has had any part to play in any of these major tragedies in the United States of America. So the United States of America needs to send an American investigation team to Canada to go through all of the Canadian government files and do a full investigation into Canadian politicians, Canadian psychopaths like Canadian police officers, Canadian military psychopaths like this guy, Colonel Russell Williams, which, by the way, he was definitely a scapegoat. Sure, yeah, he was also guilty, but Colonel Russell Williams is just one of many rapists in the Canadian military. Colonel Russell Williams is just one of many murderers in the Canadian military. And you know this because the victims of Colonel Russell Williams tried calling the Canadian police for help, and the Canadian police called the victims crazy. Laurie Massicott, she sued the Ontario Provincial Police for $7 million because when she called the Canadian police called her a crazy liar. They said, "How dare you accuse a military commander of all of Canada? How dare you accuse him of raping you?" And they hung up on Laurie Massicott. They hung up on her. Americans should they should give an interview to Laurie Massicott, and she will tell you that the Canadian police knew that Colonel Russell Williams was a serial killer and a rapist, and they covered up for him, and they let him get away with it for years. And if they covered up what he was doing to Canadian women, imagine the Canadian government for sure, especially covered up what he did to American women. Because if there was a cover up for even what Colonel Russell Williams, the Canadian military psychopath, was doing to Canadian women, yes, there was for sure, especially a cover up with the fact that Colonel Russell Williams is linked to the many missing Americans. And these missing Americans, because this psychopath also could have killed American men too and women. He preyed especially on women, but it's also possible that missing Americans in general missing American men could also be been murdered by this military psychopath. And so the United States of America needs to do a full investigation into Canada, and then Trump will have the evidence that he needs. He'll have enough. And in fact, there's already a lot given based on these news articles, based on the proof of the cover-up, right? Based on the news, even the Canadian news articles admitting that there's all these cover-ups going on in Canada. That's pretty much, you could argue that's enough for Canada to be the 51st state. But especially if Trump wants to get Canadians on board, Trump needs to send an American investigation team to Canada to go through all of the Canadian government files and then show if there is a link. Show the link between Colonel Russell Williams and the missing Americans. And then once America sees all of the corruption in Canada, once Canadians, even there's a lot of Canadians that don't even know, once Canadians see all of the corruption in Canada, then we can have an official referendum like they did with Quebec, when Quebec was deciding whether they want to separate. When Quebec was deciding whether or not they want to separate from Canada, they had a referendum. We can have another referendum, but this referendum will be whether or not Canadians want to be the 51st state of the United States of America. And we can have another referendum and we can have a vote. And I bet you when all of the corruption comes out, all of the Canadian corruption, all of these Canadian military psychopaths that raped and murdered women for years, all of the Canadian police officers who are weirdo cross dressers who rape women, all of the Canadian police officers who are murderers and psychopaths, all of the Canadian police officers who are thugs. When America does a full investigation into the government of Canada and all of the corruption in the government of Canada, then Canadians and Americans will see why maybe Canada should become the 51st state of the United States of America. And then Trump, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, the president of the biggest country in the world, the most powerful country with the most powerful American military army, then Donald Trump, the president of the United States of America, he will have the evidence, and he will have the confidence, and he will have the support of Canadians and Americans for Canada to become the 51st state of the United States of America. So we need to get Donald Trump to do a speech. He needs to say, he needs to pursue the 51st state thing, where he was saying about making Canada the 51st state of the United States of America. He needs to do an investigation into Canada, investigate Colonel Russell Williams, this convicted military psychopath, who there was a big cover up with what he was doing to Canadian women. And there was especially a cover up with the fact that he is linked, this Canadian military psychopath who is convicted of raping and murdering Canadian women, he is also linked to the many missing Americans. And if Trump wants to find the missing Americans, if the American families want to find the missing Americans, then Donald Trump should send an investigation team. Donald Trump should give a speech that in the White House saying that he's planning to send an American investigation team to Canada, or perhaps he should just do it, because if you tell the Canadian government that that Trump's going to send an investigation team, then the next thing you know, the Canadian government's going to purge the files even more. The Canadian government's going to get rid of the evidence even more, right? So maybe it's better that, and also Trump could just go ahead and just send an American investigation team to Canada to go through all of the Canadian government files. Why would Canada need to hide anything from Trump? Why would the Canadian government need to hide any government files from Trump? So Donald Trump, the president of the United States of America, the president of the biggest country in the world, the United States of America, should send an American investigation team to Canada to go through all of the Canadian government files, go through the Canadian government records, and do a full, proper investigation. And then Donald Trump and the White House and the United States of America will see how corrupt Canada really is, all of the evil stuff that Canada has done and gotten away with. And then Trump will finally have the support and the confidence from the American people and the Canadian people to make Canada the 51st state of the United States of America.